So a couple months ago, I made a video about the ban list, and in it I said that Tenpai was a very beatable deck if you knew what you were doing. And to be honest, for that time I still think that was true. But unfortunately that statement has not aged very well, and I'm starting to see why people do not like Tenpai. Because I cannot lie, I've been losing a lot to Tenpai recently, but it's not really a Tenpai issue, it's more of an issue with lingering floodgates. Specifically the non-engine, and it's all because of Rage of the Abyss. Rage of the Abyss wasn't that strong of a set. I'm going to be honest, you can probably count the number of relevant cards on both of your hands, but those few cards are extremely relevant, especially the Tenpai. I would say Tenpai only got 2 new cards, and I'm not talking about their trash support card that no one plays. It's 1, Molchami Fuaros, and 2, Dominus Impulse. So Fuaros is kind of obvious, they just added 3 more turn skips to their deck. In my last video about Memento, I talked about how Memento could play into Fuaros, and that's true in the sense that it only gives them 1 to 2 draws, but the issue is that Tenpai plays Fuaros better than every other deck. It's not only because it blinds second, but also because the deck has space for 24 hand traps. No deck comes close to the amount of non-engine that Tenpai has, and the bigger issue is now that the quantity of cards they draw is so high, between 6 Molchamis and 3 Maxis, it's likely they can draw some of the more impactful hand traps off of the Fuaros draws that it gives them. Most decks do not play all 6 Molchamis. I would say most main 3 and don't have Parelia in the list at all because it's not as good against the meta overall. But I've also played against Tenpai with Parelia, and they have told me that they were on 8 Maxis. For most normal decks that aren't Memento, the Fuaros alone is enough to stop them. The second is Dominus Impulse. The Dominus cards are fairly strong cards, it's just that no deck can really play the first one because Dark and Fire are like the majority of decks. It also has a similar purpose to Ash and says you can't Ash people if you use it, so it's a little bit hard for that one to come into play. The new one is truly insane. This one is a unique hand trap, so nothing else has a similar purpose to it, and it also just restricts much worse attributes. Earth, Wind, and Light are generally the far less played attributes, although right now pretty much only Tenpai supports this card because every other deck probably plays the Fiendsmith cards, which are all light. Aside from conflicting with Engine, you might be thinking it conflicts with hand traps, and for some it does. For example, Maxi is an Earth monster, Valor and Nib are light monsters, and Fuaros and Droll are wind monsters. It seems like, oh, it's balanced because if you use it, then you can't use either Maxi anymore, but that's not actually how it works in practice because you always just use your Maxis before you use Dominus, so it never actually conflicts. And Tenpai don't have a turn 2 anyways, so the rest of the duel is not even a real restriction. Valor is unpopular right now because it's rather low impact, so that's not really a real conflict with Dominus Impulse either, but Nib is a real conflict. That is a real trade-off that you have to make when you choose to play Dominus Impulse. Actually, I'm a bit confused seeing the list on the screen with 2 Nibs because I guess you play both because they're both high-impact hand traps, but I guess if you have to use a Dominus, then your Nib is completely dead. Like, I still think to this day, right after the ban list with 1 field spell, but Genroku being released, that the deck wasn't that strong, but I cannot stress how much the math changes by adding 6 very insane hand traps, especially when 3 of them are turn skips. The math on turn skips, not counting Parelia, is 8 with 2 shifters, 6 maxis, which is 70% on opening a turn skip. And you only have a 23% chance to open Called By. Yes, Ash Blossom will also stop maxi-like effects, but they have up to 3 maxis per turn and you only have 1 Ash stop. The math on being able to play on your turn is just really bad for you, especially because they don't even need to have the turn skips in the first place. Let's say you hit the 30% of no turn skip, 65% of the time they should open 3 hand traps with 23 hand traps in the main. A majority of the time you should expect to see 3 hand traps, which is very difficult to play through for most decks. There are also even more turn skips that I haven't mentioned yet for the post board. There's this card that is really only relevant in the OCG, but it's Retaliating Sea. I know a lot of my viewers are TCG players, so this won't really apply, but basically what this card is a shifter while face up on the field, and it specials itself when you activate a spell that specials a monster. Just thinking about the top decks, OSS and Snake Eyes, Bone Party and Memento Fusion and Memento. Yubel actually does not really get hit by this that often because they can just hold their opening of the Spirit Gates effect for later in the turn, and by then they can probably set up a Spirit of Yubel. A Phantom of Yubel, sorry. So realistically, the card does not really affect Yubel, but against my deck, Memento, and against Snake Eyes, it is quite relevant. Like, there's quite a few ways that you can drop that guy against a meta. Normally in the TCG, this wouldn't be that big of a deal. You can probably use some in-engine removal to pop it. But the issue is if you kill it in the OCG, it searches Maxi. So functionally, it is shifter 3 and 4, sort of. It's just that it can only get summoned later in the turn, which, to be fair, does matter for certain lines. The other reason Tenpai is so good is because of Azumina Fiendsmith Snake Eyes. This deck is too strong in the sense that you die instantly if they resolve their starter. It's not like a real FTK, it's just that you're not going to break what they have with your own cards. So people have resorted to playing lingering floodgates to counter Azamina, like Furos in the main, Droll maybe. And the real issue is that none of these really interact very well with Tenpai. It's a very large benefit of playing Tenpai that you play a massive amount of non-engine that affects other decks, but your deck itself plays through a majority of the non-engine played with ease. Now, if I think Tenpai is approaching best deck status, easily top 2, then why am I not playing it? Well, it's because Tenpai is not good at playing versus itself. Like, you will still lose to Tenpai if you're playing Tenpai. Maybe there's things you can do, like you can start siding some Solemns going first, or you can summon a Meteor Burst Dragon, or you can side deck that dragon that floodgates your opponent's battle phase, but these things are things that every single deck can do. It's why I don't like playing Vayu and Edison. That deck isn't very good at playing into itself. You still die if they draw their power cards, it's just that sometimes you draw your own power cards first, which is something that I never felt was super skill expressive to me. And then the other decks aside from Memento are just bad into main deck Furos, except for Centurion, which is bad into normal hand traps, like Effect Failure. So no matter how I think about it, I just always come back to Memento. I'm a competitor, so I always play what I feel gives me the best chance to win, but right now I don't really have a great solution, aside from Floodgates in the main, that everyone is trying due to Furos and Shifter. I don't really know what could play through Lingering Floods and still win versus the other good decks like Snake Eyes, and I guess that's why Centurion is so hyped right now, but that deck is just weak into normal non-engine. Now, a final deck that I think is actually pretty decent into Tenpai because it doesn't play into any of the turn skips, which is Runic Stun. But an issue I have with Runic Stun is because although the deck is extremely good into what Tenpai tends to play, as in it's not really weak to hand traps, Floodgates are pretty good against Tenpai, and it can protect from breakers that they usually have like Duster and Lightning Storm. My issue with that deck is just that I don't think that deck is very fun to play. It just feels bad. So lastly, I'll just show some results to prove my point. You can look across tournaments in Japan and Korea and Southeast Asia as well. I'm not going to be doing that in this video, but I'm just going to use China as a reference. So here are just my locals. We have 44% local, 4 Tenpai, and every single one of them converted. 3 Azamina Fiendsmith Snake Eyes in this tournament, by the way, and none of them converted. Of course, that doesn't mean anything, like, maybe these players got unlucky, or maybe they just, like, didn't know how to pilot their deck that well, like, these things don't say anything, but it's more like we're going to look at a larger sample size across more tournaments. So here's another local, 8 Tenpai. It is by far the most represented deck. Only 3 of them ended up converting, but that makes sense when you consider that not all 8 of them can convert because they're going to play each other. It's 3 Tenpai, 2 Runic Stun, which has a decent Tenpai matchup, a lone Voiceless Voice Warrior, Ritual Beast Fiendsmith. I don't really know what's going on here, actually. That seems kind of conflicting in my mind, but I guess, I mean, you don't always have to shift them when you're playing Ritual Beast. And then Azamina Fiendsmith Snake Eyes. And Runic won the tournament. So apparently the other Runic lost to Runic in the mirror. Maybe with a different top cut, then the Runics could have beaten all the Tenpais. But here's the last one I'm going to show, and I'm going to show this because I was at this one, actually. This is me, the lone Memento lover in this tournament, but there's only one Tenpai at this tournament, and then they won the entire thing. So basically, the decks that always convert are just Tenpai and Runic Stun. Like, if you play these decks, you'll pretty much always top in my local scene. And I'm pretty sure, I don't know about Runic Stun overall, but I'm very confident that Tenpai is definitely winning across all of the OCG right now, no matter where you look. Maybe, at worst, they're going to be second behind Azamina, Fiends, and Snake Eyes. I don't think they'll ever be behind any other deck besides Snake Eyes in terms of number of tops. So Tenpai is scary, and I think it will continue to be very scary in both formats, especially after Rage of the Abyss, and it's definitely something to look into if you're a TCG player. Like, Maxi is a significant reason it will be better in the OCG, but in the TCG, you'd probably just play 6 mil chummies. So the math is pretty similar on pretty bad situations for you. It's just sometimes not relevant to your deck. I would be pretty surprised if Tenpai were just bad after Rage of the Abyss in the TCG.